Hey y'all, Zach McDonald, your real estate agent with Real Property Associates, and this is my Seattle real estate market update for March 2026. Well, over the past few weeks, we've accumulated a couple pretty big headlines. We've got a war going on, and we've also got a proposed tax on people making over $1 million or more here in Washington State. So I think there's some conversations around what the heck does all this mean? How's this going to affect the housing market? And I'll tell you a little bit more later on in the video. But I think, in the midst of all these headlines, we're seeing mortgage rates rising a little bit. We're seeing the housing inventory in the greater Seattle area start to increase, which is good for buyers, but also the amount of activity we're seeing is pushing that inventory level up, right? Which could potentially slow things down in the housing market. Today, I want to talk a little bit about our current events. I want to talk about where I think the market's heading, and I want to talk about what that means for buyers and sellers here in the greater Seattle area. Before we do that, let's talk about mortgage rates right now, because I think they're seeing the biggest effect with the war news, and I think that's probably the biggest takeaway from that for now, right? I don't think it's going to affect the housing market in Seattle in any direct way, but I do think that mortgage rates are affecting everyone, and they have been affecting everyone. So we've seen mortgage rates jump up to 6.35%, and this was on Mortgage News Daily's survey on 3/12. So we're seeing mortgage rates increasing. They were hovering right around 6%. They're back up to 6.35%, which in reality is kind of around the same area they were last year. And the housing market did just fine, but it does slow things down a little bit, right? There's been some excitement about the housing market, and there's been some excitement about mortgage rates coming down, and there's been some excitement. We talked about news earlier in the year about the government buying mortgage-backed securities, right? At least the prospect of it. And here we are, we're having some more news. We're seeing mortgage rates going up. I don't think this is a long-term effect on mortgage rates, I guess, unless the war drags out. I hope it doesn't. But in that case, maybe this does last a little bit longer. But I think in the long run, mortgage rates are going to be just fine. I think as we're looking at the data from last month, we're starting to see signs, though, that the housing market is, although it is thriving right now in Seattle, it is going to start slowing down here soon. I'll briefly touch on what people are calling the millionaire tax in Washington State. And I think, if we're to get really objective about this, we've got a few high-profile people in the state that are, significantly high earners that have left. Jeff Bezos left a little while ago for Florida. Howard Schultz just said, hey, I'm moving to Florida too. I think we'll certainly see some people leave the state. The percentage of people making that amount of money on an annual basis is fairly small. You will see some of those people move out of the area. I think a lot of those people's jobs are tied to here, right? And so maybe it's not ideal to have a tax, but at the same time, they are going to benefit more by staying here than by leaving here. So, there's still a lot to play out, and I don't want to get into my opinions about whether we should have it or not. I don't think that's my place here. But I think that time will tell whether this actually continues on, and maybe there's a vote about it. And also time will tell how much of an effect it really has. My opinion about it is I don't think it's going to affect the housing market that dramatically. Although it might affect the high end, right? That might be the place where you see that, the higher end, more luxury housing market. That crowd that's buying those houses are going to be the ones that are the most affected by a law like this. So I guess my hot take, maybe the luxury market has some type of an effect, but I don't think it's going to affect the median or the average housing market here in the greater Seattle area. Let's talk about the stats, right? Some of you follow this channel just for the stats. Some of you just want to hear my thoughts on some of the news items, hot takes on things. But median sales price last month in Seattle, $945, which is actually down 0.5% year over year. You heard it. Down 0.5% year over year. I've said that a few times in recent videos, and really across the greater Seattle area, we haven't seen too much appreciation in pricing over the last year or two. Things have mostly gotten back to where they were. And I owe someone a video. They asked about me making a video comparing where the market was back in 2022 at its peak versus where the market's at now. I didn't prepare that for this video, but I think that'll be the conversation for next video. Today's video, though, I think I really want to focus on where the market's headed right now because I think we're seeing some signs of things slowing down. Bellevue median sales price last month, $1,930,000, 3.6% up year over year. And if you're new to the channel, we're looking at the stats from February, right? So we're getting to see where we ended up. And then on a weekly basis, I'm talking about where the stats are headed on the housing market watches. But Seattle's really the archetype for the west side, and Bellevue is really the archetype for the east side because they're the two largest cities on either side. Let's transition over to the average percent of list price. And this is a number, I think it's one of our first signs that things are starting to slow down or soften a little bit, at least compared to last year. And that is this, 2% below last year in Seattle, still above asking price, 1.2% over asking price, but below last year in Bellevue, 4.8% below last year, just 0.1% over asking price on average. And if we're looking at original asking price, Seattle's right at the original asking price. So there's some price reductions factored in there. Sometimes those houses end up with multiple offers. Yes, you can still have multiple offers on a listing when you drop the price if you do a more substantial price drop, I would say. Bellevue's at 98.8% of the original listing price. And again, same phenomenon. Sometimes those houses, when they're dropped, then I'll have that perceived value with buyers and you see a little bit of competition, right? But in both cases, down year over year. And days on market here, 30 days on market in Seattle, 35 days on market in Bellevue. Last month, I mentioned that we're going to start to see the days on market dropping, which is true, right? You're starting to see more of the new inventory that's selling, not taking as long compared to some of the older inventory that's been on the market for a while. In both cases, though, still up from last year quite a bit. In Seattle, just a tiny bit, 3.4%, and in Bellevue, almost 200% up. Things were selling pretty quickly in Bellevue last year. For comparison, let's look at median days on market. Median days on market in Seattle, 7 days. 7 days. 7 days also for Bellevue median days on market. And I think median days on market's a nice contrast to the average, right? Because it does help cancel out some of the outliers. And so, we're seeing there's a huge gap there, and which means there are still houses and a large percentage of houses that are selling for greater numbers when you mix them together. But still, there's a nice balance of the newer houses coming on the market selling relatively quickly, which is why I say there's houses that have been on the market for a while that are pulling up the numbers here quite a bit. If you've got a new listing and it's priced well in King County, you're most likely not going to be sitting on the market for 30, 40 days. Unless you're a condo. Unfortunately, the condos are taking a lot longer to sell in Seattle. But for the most part, single-family houses are selling relatively quickly when they come on the market right now. Let's talk about new listings now. And this is the second sign we need to pay attention to when we're talking about where the market's headed. And we've seen a ton more new listings here in Seattle than we did last year. And we're still starting to see the inventory picking up, but 37.6% more new listings last month than we saw at the same time last year, and 60.7% more new listings in Bellevue than we saw the same time last year. If we look back at the previous year, 2024, we also saw similar numbers to 2025. And so we're just seeing a significantly larger amount of new listings right now than we did just a few years back. And what that's leading us to, as we pair that with a decline in closed sales, not too much, but down 12.3% on the closed sales in Seattle, the same in Bellevue, actually. And we pair that with pending sales, which are up 20.7% in Seattle, 26.9% in Bellevue. All good signs, right? More buyer activity as well as more listing activity. The catch is the listing activity is still outpacing the buyer activity. And that's not uncommon this time of year. It really isn't. But what's uncommon is how quickly it's happening and when it's happening, how early it's happening. And so right now we find ourselves in February with 55.6% more houses, right? So 1.5 times, right? The houses. And in Bellevue, 122%, so more than double the amount of houses available that we saw at the same time last year. So heading into March, right, huge amounts of houses for sale. And if we look back 2 years ago, in 2024, we had 566 houses for sale in Seattle. This year, 1,041. Ton more houses on the market. Again, more buyer activity for sure. So I don't want to scare you, but still a lot more inventory. 67 houses for sale in Bellevue 2 years ago, 182 houses for sale in Bellevue. So again, lots more on the market. And that just puts us in a different spot in the end of February, heading into March. We are in March, right? But we're just talking about the February data. 2.1 months of supply in Seattle, 2.2 months of supply in Bellevue. And not surprisingly, the supply is up similarly to the amount of houses on the market. Makes sense. 50% more supply in Seattle and 120% more supply in Bellevue. This is a ton more housing heading into March. And what we're seeing, and if we look back at last year, 1.4 months of supply in Seattle and 1 month of supply in Bellevue. Back in 2024, 1.2 months of supply and 1 month of supply in Bellevue. So considerably more housing on the market, right? Heading into the spring market. What we're seeing right now is a normal seasonal cycle where we start to see more listings coming on the market, inventory increasing. What we're seeing though is we're seeing that happening a lot sooner than normal. And in 2025, back in April, we were at 1.9 months of supply in Seattle, 2.2 months of supply in Bellevue. Let's call that about the same place, right? In April, this is April we're talking about. We are talking about February this year, having a similar amount of inventory as we did in April of last year. We get to May and the inventory last year gets beyond this to 2.6 months of supply in Seattle, 3 months of supply in Bellevue. And we see the inventory stick there until August when it starts to dwindle a little bit. But really, most of the rest of the year until the winter, we get through the fall, was at or above where we're at right now. And the market last year started to slow down when we got to May. And really, when we got to April, things started to slow down. And we're in February, right? So just looking at the signs, I am thinking that we are on the tail end this year of some of the competition we've been talking about, and that we're starting to near a point where if inventory continues to pick up, and we don't know if that's going to continue, but if it does continue to pick up and the buyer activity, even though it's been better, doesn't keep up, then we're going to find ourselves in a similar situation as 2025, where the market is a little softer in the summer and the fall. And again, that's normal, but I think it's going to be more soft than it was last year. And last year was a little more soft maybe than what people have been used to experiencing here over the past 10 years or so because of how competitive the housing market's been here in Seattle. So we're going to keep paying attention to this. I think it's important to think about the news, as we talked about earlier on in the update, what's going on in the world, what's going on here in the state, and what's going on right in our backyards when we talk about job situations. But at the same time, I think we want to pay attention to what's happening in the housing market when we're talking specifically about real estate. And some of this data points to the fact that we're in the tail end of the spring housing market, even though, according to my records, we haven't even started spring here in Seattle. So what does this mean for buyers and sellers in the greater Seattle area? And I think for buyers, it means you're going to have more and more options as the spring progresses. You're going to see, number one, just more choices. Whether you're in Seattle or Bellevue or Redmond or Renton or Kirkland or Shoreline, wherever you find yourself, King County or Snohomish County, you're going to just see more choices. And you're going to have less competition for those choices. Fewer people fighting over the same house. That's amazing, right? So I think you're in a good spot as a buyer to have more choice, less competition. For sellers, you are going to be competing with more houses. So instead of the buyers competing, you're competing. And that means that the prep work you do is going to matter more than it does when it's less competitive, and you need to stand out. If your house has a bunch of projects to do, buyers are going to be less excited about that than the same exact house that has fewer projects to do. And they're also going to be more excited about a better price on a similar house over yours. And so you're going to be competing on price, but also what is your house offering, right? What's the best total package? And so instead of the buyers competing, the sellers are competing to stand out from the competition. Thanks so much for tuning into this month's Seattle real estate market update. If you made it to the end, I know you got some value out of this video, so please consider giving it a thumbs up. And if there's any way I can bring value to your situation, if you're thinking about moving to the Seattle area, if you're thinking about buying a house, if you're thinking about selling a house, and I can help and add some value to you, please feel free to reach out.